Meeting at the cafe. Max, don't drag this out, tell us what happened. Artyom, a young journalist with burning eyes and a notebook in his hands, leaned closer. You do realize that your adventure is a sensation, right? A sensation? I grinned and took a sip of coffee. It's more of a life lesson. Although, if you want your hair to stand on end, then listen carefully. But I warn you, there will be no fantasy, only naked reality. That's exactly what I need, Artyom nodded, getting ready to write it down. I paused, looking around the cafe. It was cozy, but the noise of the crowd was slightly distracting. I didn't like to tell this story, but apparently it was meant to be a warning to others. Background. My name is Max, I'm 34 years old, and my life has seemed extremely predictable for a long time. I lost my parents early, and since then I got used to counting only on myself. An office job, the same days, an empty apartment in the center of the city. You know that feeling when everything seems normal, but there's an endless emptiness inside? And then one day everything changed. One ordinary weekday, I got a letter of redundancy. My department was abolished. And here I am unemployed, with a lot of time and no idea where to go next. Somehow automatically I packed a backpack and decided to go to the woods. Just to walk around, to think. The forest always seemed to me a place where you can be alone with yourself. But I had never imagined that this walk would change my life. Part 1, a call to adventure. I walked through the forest for several hours, not really paying attention to the time. At first, everything seemed beautiful and peaceful. The sun was shining through the leaves, and a light breeze rustled the leaves. But soon the path I was following seemed to disappear. I looked around and realized that I was lost. Well, Max, great plan. I mumbled to myself, trying to keep up my optimism. Great walk, damn you. The sun was setting, and I was getting deeper into the woods. That's when I heard the sound. A sharp, piercing scream that made me stop. I froze, listening. It came again, closer. My heart pounded somewhere in my throat. It's just a bird, I told myself, but my instincts told me otherwise. Hey! Who's there? I shouted, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. There was only silence. I took a couple steps forward, trying not to panic, and suddenly I noticed a dim light in the distance. At first I thought it was a trick of the eye, but the light didn't go away. It was the only landmark, and I decided to walk toward it. Part 2, crossing the first rapids. When I got closer, there was a small hut in front of me, hidden among the trees. Light came from the window, flickering as if inviting me in. I couldn't believe my luck, civilization. I knocked on the door. The seconds of waiting stretched like an eternity. Finally, the door opened and a man appeared on the threshold. A forester. Tall, with a thick beard and a hard stare that seemed to pierce through me. Lost? He asked hoarsely before I could say anything. Yes. Yeah, I guess so, I mumbled, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. Come on in, he said briefly, stepping aside to let me pass. It was warm and cozy inside. The smell of fresh soup hit my nose, and I realized how hungry I was. The forester pointed to a chair at a wooden table. Eat, he said without smiling. His voice was steady, but there was a strange note in it. I took the spoon, but I barely tasted the soup before I felt something strange. Not with the food, but inside me. It was as if everything around me had gotten a little slower. I looked up and saw the forester looking at me carefully, as if evaluating me. You're not the first to come here, he said quietly, leaning on the table. The forest, it takes those who are weak. But you seem different. The words made me tense. My heart beat faster again. I wanted to say something, but the forester continued. Tonight you will have to prove who you really are. The forest will test you. Are you ready? Ready? What does that even mean? But his tone left no room for questions. I just nodded, though inside everything turned over with fear and bewilderment. Part 3, Trials. When night fell, the forester left, leaving me alone in the cabin. The silence around me was ominous, as if the forest breathed in unison with my fear. The wind howled outside the windows, but it wasn't just a sound. It seemed filled with whispers, quiet voices I couldn't make out. The door suddenly swung open sharply, and cold air rushed in. I froze, unable to move. There were shadows in the doorway. People? No, not really. Their outlines were blurred, like silhouettes in a thick fog. They were just staring at me. "Go," came the ranger's voice from outside. "They're waiting." I went out, though my legs trembled with fear. The shadows began to move, forming a circle around me. They didn't attack, just stared, but their gazes were heavy, almost tangible. "What do you want?" I shouted, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. There was no answer, only the wind increased, whispering louder and louder. Then I heard words that seemed to come from within me. "Accept yourself. Or stay here forever." It all felt like a nightmare, but I felt like I had to do something. Make a choice. And that choice could decide everything. Epilogue, a new life. Is that it? Artyom looked disappointed. "No, of course not," I smiled. When I came out of the forest, I realized everything has changed. I'm no longer chasing other people's dreams. I've become honest with myself. And you know what the most important thing is? Life is not a race for comfort. It's a struggle for inner freedom. "So, Max, did the forest save you?" Artyom asked, pensively leafing through his notebook. "Not exactly," I answered. "The forest simply showed me who I was. And gave me a chance to start living for real. The forest taught me that the hardest thing is not survival, but accepting oneself. We often live our lives running away from the fear of being exposed to ourselves, hiding behind habits, work, endless responsibilities. But when the forest took everything away from me, the comfort, the familiar world, even the certainty of reality, I was left with only myself. In the silence of this place I realized, every person comes to the forest of his life to face his fears. The forest may be different circumstances, loss, change. But as long as you run away, the forest will chase you around. Now I know that leaving the familiar world is not the end, but the beginning of a journey. And if you get lost in your life, it's not a tragedy. It's a chance to stop, look around and ask yourself, who am I? What do I really want? The woodsman, the shadows, the night wind, all became part of my journey, steps toward myself. I came out of the forest a different person. Not without fear, not without doubt, but with the certainty that these trials were not a punishment, but a blessing. When I returned to the world, it seemed brighter, more contrasting. I could taste the coffee, hear the birds chirping, savor every second. Because now I knew, life is real only when you allow yourself to live truly. If the forest is calling you, don't be afraid. Answer its call. And maybe you will find there not only yourself, but also a new life. Prologue, backstory. His name is Jackson Gray. A name that would cause whispers and nervous glances in his hometown. He was once just a guy no one expected to do anything bad, an average student, a good worker, an ordinary son. But his life changed on a day he could not forget. It was a warm summer evening. Jackson was walking home after a long day of work when he noticed a stranger trying to get into his neighbor's yard. He shouldn't have interfered, but he did. "Hey, what are you doing?" he called out, approaching. The man turned around, his eyes blazing with anger. A knife flashed in his hands. Jackson didn't have time to react before the stranger lunged at him. It all happened so fast, the blow, the struggle, the fall to the ground. Despairing and afraid, Jackson grabbed a rock and struck. Again. And again. When he stopped, the man's body lay motionless. Jackson's breathing was ragged, his hands were shaking. He looked around, there was no one around. He told himself it was self-defense, but the memories of his last moments haunted him. In court, he tried to explain, but no one listened. "You're a monster," the victim's wife screamed at the last hearing, her face contorted with pain. Jackson sat with his head down, looking at his hands, which now seemed alien, as if they, and not he, had committed the murder. Part 1, Escape. A dark prison corridor, cold, filled with the smell of despair and rot. The sounds of guards' footsteps, the loud clanking of iron doors, all this filled him with hopelessness. Jackson knew that he would not survive here, not with this brand of a killer, not with this oppression on his heart. Escape was his only chance. The plan had been brewing for several months. It all started with maps that he made from memory, watching the movements of the guards. But most importantly, he learned about an old, almost forgotten part of the sewer system that led straight to the forest behind the prison. This information cost him several weeks of hunger and several blows from cellmates whom he refused to help. He stood in the corner of the cell, listening to the rain outside the window, when the guard, as usual, approached the door. Pulling himself together, Jackson pretended to lose consciousness. The roar of the guards, the noise of the door opening, and the sudden impact all passed in a blur. The keys were in his hand. "This is your chance, don't miss it," he whispered to himself. The sewer greeted him with black, sticky mud. The smell was unbearable, but the worst thing was the sounds. Rustles, echoes, as if someone was whispering in the void. Jackson pushed forward, clinging to the cold walls, feeling the cobwebs sticking to his face. The dark stories he had heard from other prisoners thundered in his head. This forest swallows people. No one comes back. Finally, he got outside. The wind hit his face, and the forest in front of him seemed like a living creature. The trees whispered something dull, their branches resembled ugly hands. Every step in this rotten, dark place echoed in his mind. Jackson knew he wasn't just running from the law anymore, he was running from something far worse. A leap into the darkness. A thud. The silence of the forest. Jackson disappeared into the trees, his breathing louder than the wind. Every branch felt like a trap, every sound like a signal for his end. He was like a cornered animal. The night was getting deeper, the forest was getting darker. Part 2, The Hunter. On the third night, he met him, a man with a gun. But this was no ordinary hunter. Jackson noticed the tripwires scattered around the camp and saw the man hiding the carcass of a dead deer under a camouflage net. This was a poacher, and his hands were as dirty as the gun. Jackson stepped closer, trying to remain calm. "Hey, I'm just passing through. Not looking for trouble." The man turned around, his face twisted in anger, like a mask. "Passing? On my land?" His voice was sharp as a whip. Jackson felt the air around him tighten. He looked at the dead animal, whose eyes were still wide open, and something inside him boiled. He remembered his dog Bailey, whom he had lost when he was young to hunters who had surrounded their farm. "What are you doing? You have no conscience!" Jackson shouted, feeling the rage escaping. The man laughed, but there was nothing human in that laugh. "You, who escaped from prison, are telling me about rights." He stepped closer, the knife flashing in his hands. The poacher's words were the last straw. Jackson rushed at him, not thinking and not feeling anything. It was complete madness. A dirty fight, brutal, filled with the sounds of tearing fabric, blows and blood. When it was all over, Jackson stood over the body. His hands were shaking and his ears were ringing. He whispered, almost not hearing himself, again. "You should have stopped at least this time." But his gaze fell on the knife that lay nearby. For a moment, he felt something dark and terrible echoing inside him. Why did this man seem so familiar to him? Everything was wrong, like a game where all the roles were mixed up. Part 3, The Car. Hiding the body of the dead poacher, Jackson wiped the blood from his hands, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain away, leaving an emptiness. "It's getting worse and worse," he muttered, stepping back onto the path. The forest behind him seemed to mock him, every sound echoing in his head like a chorus of accusations. He walked along the road, not knowing where his path would lead him, until he saw headlights approaching from a distance. The car stopped. An older man got out, thin, wearing a wide-crowned hat. His face, despite his friendly smile, seemed stern. "Lost, Kid? He asked, scanning Jackson with a careful gaze. Jackson nodded. I'm just trying to get out of this damn forest. The man waved his hand, offering him a ride. But once they were in the car, the conversation took a strange turn. Where have I seen you before? The driver asked. Jackson tensed. I'm just a guy trying to get through another bad night. You know I look like a fugitive. The driver gave him a short, cold look. Jackson's hands clenched into fists. What's it to you? He muttered. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in his gaze. The old cop nose still there. You're on the run, kid. The words cut into his consciousness. Jackson tried to force out a nervous laugh. It's just a coincidence. But the driver suddenly reached for the glove compartment. Jackson took off like lightning, lunging at the man, and a struggle began. The car swerved, jerked, and flipped over. Screams, the sound of metal hitting the ground, the sound of shattering glass all mixed into a hellish symphony. When Jackson climbed out, all cut up by shrapnel, he saw the motionless body of the driver. The man was not breathing. His head was turned unnaturally, his eyes staring into space. Jackson sat down on the ground, clutching his head in his hands. Damn it! It was me. I did it again. His heart was pounding like a drum. The meaning of what was happening refused to reach his consciousness. He did not want this, but deep down he knew, understood everything he touched now turns to death. The stars above his head twinkled indifferently, as if they were watching his suffering. He stood up and, staggering, moved further down the road, leaving another tragedy in his wake. Part 4, The Solution. Jackson felt the world crumbling around him. He ran until he collapsed. His mind, like an enchanted mirror, reflected back the faces of the people he had met along the way. Their eyes, filled with reproach and pain, looked straight into his soul. His mother's words surfaced like an inescapable sentence, everyone pays for their sins, son. He had killed the hunter, but not just like that. He had been a poacher, a strangler of life, an enemy of everything Jackson had ever loved. But that truth brought no relief now. Then there was the driver, an old man with a stern gaze and a tenacious mind who had seen through him too quickly. And now he was a victim of his own decisions. Broken and tired, Jackson lay on the ground by the side of the road. The dirt and cold of the earth seemed to penetrate him from within, making not only his body but also his mind tremble. The sky above him was so quiet and indifferent, as if the world had rejected him forever. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Forgive me if you can." But who should forgive? Those he sent to the grave, or himself? His lips trembled, and a half-groan, half-roar escaped from his chest. I didn't want this. It's not my fault. The world was contemptuously silent, and this silence sounded louder than any scream. Part 5, Death. The headlights pierced the night. The car, not noticing Jackson, crashed into his body at full speed. The last thing he felt was... no, not pain. It was warmth, and it was not from the lights. It was something else, inexplicable, like forgiveness that he did not expect, but craved with all his heart. His consciousness, clinging to the last threads of life, drew a hunter in front of him. You were the one who should have died, the man whispered loudly, and his finger, like a gun, was pointed at Jackson's chest. His voice now sounded a strange mixture of reproach and understanding. Jackson wanted to say something, but his breathing became shallow, and the words were stuck somewhere deep inside. His gaze, clouded with pain, still expressed relief. The darkness began to slowly envelop him, but it did not frighten him. He felt the world finally letting go of him. Everything disappeared into an endless peace that seemed well-earned. Epilogue. When Jackson's body was found in the morning, a smile froze on his face. Maybe in his last moments he realized something he hadn't seen his whole life. Maybe he felt that his duty to himself was fulfilled. Or it was just an illusion, the last gift of a dying consciousness. Be that as it may, his story became a lesson for everyone who heard about it. We cannot rewrite our past, but we can change the future. Understand that mistakes are not the end, but the beginning of the path to forgiveness. And if at the end of the road we can smile like Jackson, then perhaps our karma will also become lighter. An act is a trace that we leave in the world. Sometimes we ourselves do not understand how deeply we hurt others. No, not with a knife, with actions, words. Jackson was looking for freedom, but found only the chains of his sins. Fate is a mirror of our actions, his father said, and Jackson understood this too late. His death was a loud reminder that no one can run away from their truth. And if we are not ready to face it, it will find us. Every action is a trace that we leave in the world. Sometimes we ourselves do not understand how deeply we cut others. Karma is the effect of a chain of events, where each action gives rise to consequences. This is not mysticism, but logic. Our decisions, our mistakes create the path we follow. But is there an end to this path? Or are we forced to repeat our mistakes over and over again until we find the strength to correct them? Jackson became a victim of his passions, his fears. He believed that he could escape, but the truth caught up with him. His meeting with the hunter, the driver, his dark thoughts, these were not accidents. They were links in one chain that wrapped around his soul, squeezing him tighter with the force of circumstances with each step. Perhaps he was not the monster that others considered him, but in an attempt to protect himself, he created even more suffering. Punishment? It is not always prison or death. Punishment is awareness, eternal judgment within us. But forgiveness, especially for yourself, it is not easy. Accepting yourself, understanding what you have done, finding the strength to correct it, this is what requires real courage and incredible effort. Forgiveness is not getting rid of responsibility, it is liberation from self-hatred.
Part 1. A Chance to Escape. You know, Anya said, swirling the wine in her glass as she gazed out at the lake. I always thought solitude would be peaceful, but this place, it's unsettling. Unsettling? Sophie's voice crackled through the speakerphone. You've been there for 2 days, and already you're spooked? It's a rental, not a haunted mansion. Anya sighed. It's not the house. It's the silence. It's too much. After her divorce, Anya had jumped at the chance to escape the city. A quaint lakeside cabin seemed perfect, a way to disconnect and rediscover herself. But the isolation was heavier than she anticipated, like a weight pressing down on her chest. Part 2. The Unseen Visitor. The first night was restless. Every creak of the wooden floor, every rustle outside, jolted her awake. The second night, it was worse. As she was closing the blinds, a strange light in the distance caught her eye. It hovered above the tree line, pulsing faintly. Anya's heart raced as she watched it disappear, only to reappear moments later, closer this time. Probably a drone, she muttered, trying to convince herself. But drones didn't emit that low, resonating hum that seemed to vibrate through her bones. Part 3. Into the Unknown. Curiosity, or perhaps foolishness, got the better of her. Armed with a flashlight and her grandfather's old hunting knife, she ventured into the forest. The air was thick, heavy with an electric charge that made her skin prickle. The light was ahead, growing brighter, pulling her deeper into the woods. What she found was beyond comprehension, a sleek, metallic craft hovering inches above the ground. It pulsed with an otherworldly glow, its surface shifting like liquid metal. Before she could process what she was seeing, a figure emerged. It was tall and slender, its eyes large and black, its presence both terrifying and mesmerizing. Anya froze. The figure raised a hand, or what she assumed was a hand, and in her mind, she heard a voice. You are not alone. Part 4. A Night to Forget. Anya woke up in her bed, drenched in sweat. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow on the familiar surroundings of the guest room. For a brief, blissful moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare. But then she noticed the small, triangular mark on the inside of her wrist, 3 tiny dots arranged in a perfect triangle. Her stomach churned as the memories of the previous night came flooding back. The light, the figure, the voice, it had all been real. She stumbled to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face, trying to calm her racing thoughts. As she stared at her reflection in the mirror, she noticed something else. Her eyes, usually a soft hazel, now had a faint, metallic sheen to them. Panic surged through her as she tried to rationalize what was happening. Part 5, The Awakening. The sound of her phone ringing jolted her out of her thoughts. She ran back to the bedroom and grabbed it, relief flooding her when she saw Sophie's name on the screen. Sophie. Thank God. Anya cried, her voice trembling. Something happened last night. I don't know how to explain it, but... Anya, Sophie interrupted, her tone unusually serious. You need to get out of there. Right now. What? Why? What's going on? I don't have time to explain, but I did some digging after you called. That area where you're staying, there have been reports. Strange sightings, disappearances. People who've gone there and never come back. Anya's blood ran cold. What do you mean? What kind of reports? Just get out, Anya. Please. I'll meet you at my place. We'll figure this out together. The line went dead. Anya stared at the phone, her mind racing. Sophie's urgency only added to her growing sense of dread. She packed her belongings in record time, throwing everything into her duffel bag without care. As she stepped out onto the porch, she glanced back at the forest one last time. The clearing where the craft had been was empty, but the memory of it burned vividly in her mind. She got into her car and sped down the gravel driveway, her heart pounding with every mile that put distance between her and the house. But even as the countryside blurred past her window, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Epilogue, the mark left behind. Anya never returned to the cabin. At Sophie's insistence, she underwent every test and scan imaginable. But doctors found nothing unusual, except for the triangular mark on her wrist, which they dismissed as a minor skin irritation. Weeks turned into months, and Anya tried to move on. But the memories lingered, vivid and unrelenting. She couldn't forget the figure, the voice, the way it spoke to her without words. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, she noticed the mark on her wrist glowing faintly. Her heart raced as she stared at it, a single thought echoing in her mind: you are not alone. The hum returned, faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Anya stood frozen, staring out the window as a light appeared in the distance, pulsing softly. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun.
Introduction. The forest of Moonless Valley has always been an object of rumor and fear. Its gloomy thickets, frozen out of time, seemed to be the haunt of old legends. Some said it was the abode of an ancient spirit that devoured souls, others that it was a mere obsession. Mikhail had never believed these tales until one day, years after his childhood, he was drawn there. It wasn't a spontaneous decision. It was a long, agonizing call, germinating in his consciousness. Something inside whispered, "You have to find out the truth or this feeling won't let go." Katerina, his longtime girlfriend, took to the idea with enthusiasm. "Let's check it out," she suggested, with a smirk. "You're not the type to be afraid of fairy tales, are you?" But if Michael had known what awaited them, he would never have set foot outside the threshold of the valley. The backstory. Mikhail's grandfather was a man of few words, but every story he told, spoken in a husky voice, tugged at the heartstrings. As a child, he told of terrifying walks in Moonless Valley. But one day he stopped abruptly and warned, "Those trees see you. No matter what you do, they always know who you really are." Mikhail only shrugged his shoulders at the time, but the years passed, and the images from his grandfather's stories took root in his mind. Why did he come back? Why was he silent? And what had he seen there, in that forest? The answers did not give rest, and when one day Mikhail found himself at the threshold of that very valley, everything inside told him, you will learn the truth. Part 1. Ordinary world. Mikhail lived an ordinary life, work, rare meetings with friends, endless attempts to fill the void. Life in the city was monotonous, devoid of spark. The only thing that kept him going were short conversations with Katerina. She was the only person who understood his longing for something more. Mish, she said one day, sipping coffee. You want to get out of all this? You know, feel alive? Those words seared into his soul. That's when he remembered Moonless Valley. Part 2. A call to adventure. Katerina accepted his offer almost immediately. Are you serious? She laughed, but her eyes glittered. I thought you were joking. What if there really is something there? Mikhail only shrugged, then we'll be the first to know the truth. And so, a week later, they stood at the edge of the forest. The air was strangely heavy, as if imbued with something old, unseen. This seems like a bad idea, Katerina muttered, but took a step forward nonetheless. Part 3. Refusing to be summoned. They walked for almost an hour until they began to feel a strange pressure. Shit, Katerina stopped, her voice shaking. Why does it feel like we've gone too far? Mikhail looked at her silently. Should we really go back? But something inside, some quiet whisper, kept her from backing away. Suddenly, a sound came from behind the trees, something between a whisper and a roar. Did you hear that? Katerina grasped his arm. Mikhail nodded. They were no longer alone. Part 4. Meeting my mentor. The noise grew louder, as if the trees themselves were whispering something to each other. Katerina recoiled. Misha, this isn't normal. The forest shouldn't sound like that. Mikhail tried to reassure her, maybe it's just the wind. But inside everything was screaming that there could be no wind here. And then, right in front of them, a figure emerged from the fog. An old man in dark, faded clothes. He was thin, with angular features and strangely glowing eyes. You've gone farther than you should have. His voice was quiet, but somehow penetrating. Who are you? Katerina blurted out, stepping back. The question is not who I am. The question is why you came here. The old man bowed his head as if scrutinizing them. Everyone who enters this forest carries their truth. And you are no exception. Mikhail felt everything turn upside down inside. What are you talking about? The old man grinned. You will soon find out. But remember, the forest only accepts those who are willing to accept themselves. And before they could say anything, he disappeared, as if vanishing into the mist. Part 5. Crossing the first rapids. After the meeting with the old man, the forest seemed different. The silence was deeper, the darkness thicker. Trees shrank around them as if animated, and the air was filled with the heavy, damp odor of decay. We have to go back, Katerina squeezed Mikhail's hand. He looked up at her. You can leave, but I can't. If I leave now, I'll never be able to sleep properly again. His voice sounded firm, but inside he was seething with fear. They continued walking until they came to a small clearing. Scattered things lay on the ground, faded backpacks, torn clothes, old maps. Is this a camp? Katerina looked around in horror. But Mikhail noticed something odd. All the things looked as if they had been lying there for decades, but there were no signs of decay or the ravages of time. Part 6. Trials, allies, enemies. When they decided to move on, the forest seemed to come alive. Every rustle made them flinch. Do you hear that? Katerina turned around. In the distance, someone or something was rustling leaves. Could it be an animal? Mikhail tried to speak confidently, but his voice gave him away. Suddenly there was a scraping sound, as if claws had been swiped across the wood. They turned around, but saw nothing. Katerina screamed, I can't take it anymore, Misha. This place wants to kill us. He tried to calm her down, but he himself could already feel something dark and cold slowly creeping into their minds. "We have to stick together," he said, but immediately realized she wasn't there. Katerina was gone. Part 7. Approaching the cave. Mikhail was thrashing between the trees, shouting her name. "Katya! Where are you?" The forest seemed to savor his fear. Every step he took echoed with strange, alien sounds. And then he heard her voice. Weak, hoarse, full of fear. "Misha, help." He rushed toward the sound, but he didn't find her. Instead, he came upon a huge tree trunk covered with strange red marks, as if it had a life of its own. For a moment he thought the tree was looking right at him. "You won't find her until you find yourself," came a whisper from nowhere. "What does that mean?" Mikhail shouted into the void. But there was no answer. Part 8. The Greatest Test. Katerina's voice sounded fainter and fainter, as if dissolving into the whisper of the forest. Mikhail did not stop calling for her, but he felt that time was running out. At every step the forest seemed to push him, creating more and more obstacles, tree roots that stretched like snakes, and thick fog that made it impossible to see the road. "Enough!" he shouted in frustration, slamming his fist into the nearest trunk. "I know what you're doing, forest. But I'm not giving up. I'll find her." With those words, he felt a strange calm inside him, as if the fear that had tormented him all this time had suddenly receded. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and just listened. Silence. No, not silence exactly. A barely perceptible sound, like breathing or faint whisper, came from somewhere to his left. Mikhail took a step in that direction, and it was as if the world had changed. The fog cleared and he saw Katerina sitting on the ground under a huge tree. Her face was pale, but her eyes, they burned with a strange luster. "Katya! Thank God I found you." Mikhail fell on his knees before her. She raised her head and whispered, "Why have you come, Misha? You don't understand. This place, it changes us." Part 9. Reward. Mikhail lifted her to her feet, but she shivered. "Katya, we're going to get out of here. Together. Hold on to me, do you hear me?" There was a desperate determination in his voice. She remained silent, but her hand still encircled his wrist. They walked slowly, stumbling over roots and breaking through branches that seemed to get in their way on purpose. The forest did not want to let them go. But with each step Mikhail felt something inside him change. There was no longer the panic that had overwhelmed him at the beginning. Every step was a struggle, but now he knew that he was stronger. And then, after what seemed like an eternity of hours of wandering, they saw light. Real daylight, shining through the trees. Part 10. The Way Back. They came to the edge of the forest, and Mikhail felt the air around them becoming lighter and the noise of the forest becoming quieter. Katerina turned to him. "You saved us, Misha. But what if this forest will always be with us now? What if we'll never be the same again?" Her words echoed in his soul. For he felt it too. The forest had left its imprint. Part 11. Resurrection. Mikhail looked at Katerina for a long time, trying to find words. Finally he said, "We may not be the same. But perhaps it's for the best. This forest has shown us who we really are. And you know what? I'm ready to accept that." His voice sounded firm, but inside he was still struggling with doubts. Katerina nodded. "You're right. But I still can't get over his whispers. They sounded like they knew everything about me." Part 12. Returning with the elixir. They returned to the city, but they both knew that their old life was somewhere behind them. Mikhail felt that he had become stronger, but now he saw the world differently. Every day he understood more and more the old man's words. The forest accepts only those who are ready to accept themselves. That phrase haunted him, making him replay the events in his head over and over again. But he realized the main thing: sometimes you have to get lost to find yourself. Epilogue. A few years later, Mikhail met an old man from the forest by chance. He was sitting on a bench in the city park, just as calm and mysterious. "You knew this would happen," Mikhail began. The old man looked at him and smiled slightly. "The forest only gives answers to those who are ready to hear them." Mikhail wanted to ask more, but the old man got up and walked away, leaving only the faint smell of pine needles behind him. Mikhail stood looking after him and thought, was he really there,